Hello again, and welcome back to episode 4, where we finally get down to the business of looking at early Genesis. Now, a word of warning, maybe this is redundant if you've looked on YouTube and seen how long this video is, but a word of warning, I'm almost certain this is going to be well past 30 minutes, which is not as advertised, and for that, I am truly sorry, and I humbly repent. Now, it's even worse than that, because what I'm going to suggest that you do at first is, before you proceed, is actually hit pause and read through the first 11 chapters of Genesis before we start to talk about it. It's best if you read it aloud, because there are many, many things, patterns in the use of language and repetitions and things like that, that are far easier to notice if you are listening and not just reading silently. Also, when we read silently, we tend to skip over the things that we think are not important or that we find boring. But when you read aloud, you must read everything, and it draws more to your attention. Now, reading these chapters aloud takes me about 45 minutes. And so it really is my hearty recommendation that you hit pause and read the text before you go on with the rest of these videos. So let's just hit pause now, and I'm just going to assume that you've obeyed me. Okay, welcome back. So what you saw, what you heard when you read through that, hopefully aloud, what you heard were all the things I'm about to show you. And if you didn't read it aloud, well, shame on you, first of all. And secondly, here's what you would have found. So it starts off with what I will call creation story number 1. This is the familiar creation week, quote unquote, where there are 6 days of creation and then 1 day of rest. Then we have the story set in the Garden of Eden, and we begin with chapter 2, which sets the setting and introduces the characters. Chapter 3 is the plot, where the characters start to talk to each other, and there's some consternation about what to do. And so that's the Garden of Eden story. And I think we can call this creation story number 2, because if our Bibles actually started at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, you would never know that there was anything missing. It reads like the beginning. And so it really is starting over, and it is a different but complementary creation story. Then we have the Cain and Abel story. Then some oddities concerning Cain and his family, just a strange little things, which if you read it aloud, you might have wondered, why is this here? Well, we'll talk about that. Then there is a genealogy that plows through the generations pretty quickly. I believe it's 10 generations, and it goes quite fast. Then we have what may be one of the most perplexing Bible passages in the entire Bible, actually. Most scholars, when you read through commentaries on Genesis, when they get to this 4-verse passage, they quite candidly admit, we don't really know what's going on here or what to make of it. Then we have the very familiar flood story featuring Noah, who, if you notice, doesn't speak at all during the flood story. After which, God makes a covenant with Noah and with all of creation. That's followed by a fairly disturbing story about Noah and his family, and this is the one time Noah does speak in the Bible. And when he does, it's a bit disturbing. That's followed by a different kind of genealogy that does not plow through the generations, but rather spreads out and describes all the different nations and from whom they are descended and where they settled. Then we have the more familiar Tower of Babel story, which astonishingly is only 9 verses long, and that's followed by yet another genealogy that plows through, yet again, I believe, 10 generations quite quickly. That's what is in early Genesis, and we are going to talk about all these things, but not exactly in this order. Instead, we're going to for this video series, break all of these passages up into groups, 5 groups. So here are the 5 groups, and I'll describe what's in them. So group number 1, which I'm calling the 7 days, that is the familiar creation week. And that's what we'll be looking at today. Group number 2, I call Eden, because everything that happens here happens in Eden. We have the Garden of Eden story with the setting and the characters, followed by the plot, as we discussed. And then the Cain and Abel story also takes place in Eden. We know this because at the end of it, Cain is sent away, and now it says he must live east of Eden. Group 3, the flood. This has the familiar flood story, yes, but then it also has God's blessing on humanity and God's covenant with all of creation. Group 4 might be surprising. If you read through all of early Genesis, it might not have struck you that there were anti-king passages in there, passages designed to make you think badly about the idea of having a king. But I'm going to try to convince you there are, and here's what I believe they are. Those oddities concerning Cain and his family, that very strange passage I'm calling the Nephilim, and the Tower of Babel story also. Again, I'll try to make that case in a later video. And lastly, we will look at the genealogies. The quick one from Adam to Noah. The disturbing story about Noah and his family is actually connected. It flows right into the genealogy that spreads out to all the nations, and there's a reason for that. So they are connected, and they do tell quite a story. And then we have the genealogy that gets us up to Abram, who is also Abraham. That's what we'll be doing. And this is the table of contents for our video series, but we start on this video with group number 1, the 7 days. So let us begin. Now, what we're going to do as we look at Genesis chapter 1, it's essentially chapter 1. It goes a little bit into chapter 2. What we're going to do in this video is look outside the text and then inside the text. And here's what I mean by that. When we look outside the text, we're going to look at the rest of the ancient Near East. We're going to see that they also have creation stories, and we're going to see how Genesis 1 is different when you place it in its context. It's actually shockingly different from anything else that is in the ancient Near East. And it's in those differences that we're going to see what Genesis 1 is proclaiming. Then we're going to look inside the text by looking at how it is structured. Because in the ancient world, how a literary passage was structured was actually a really important clue as to what they thought was most important. So let's start by looking outside the text and comparing and contrasting with the ancient Near East. Now, what's important to know about the ancient Near East is that there were already creation stories around long before the time of Moses. Many of them, as Genesis does, many of them began with what I'm going to call primordial waters of chaos. Many of them last for a week. All of them, like Genesis does, ends up with our world of earth and air as a kind of safe bubble, surrounded above and below, and on the sides, surrounded by water. So this is something that already existed and was common in those times. And I'd like to read you some examples. So I'm going to read you an example from an Akkadian creation story. I'm going to read just a short passage. Just before this passage, the various gods are getting, and there are many of them, are getting tired of all the work they have to do to maintain this world they've created for themselves. So they come up with the idea of creating humans as a slave class. And we join the story. The goddess they called to inquire, the midwife of the gods, the wise Mami. And they said, "Thou art the mother womb, the one who creates mankind. Create then the savage, the first man, and let him bear the yoke. The yoke he shall bear, the work of the gods, man shall bear." And if we were to keep reading, we would find that this goddess, the wise Mami, goes on to create mankind out of clay that has been mixed with the flesh and blood of a slain god. And then a Babylonian creation story. And remember, all of these are from well before the time of Moses. So all of these would have been around already, circulating in the cultural background as the Israelite nation was being formed. At the beginning of this Babylonian creation story, all that exists is a swirling mass of chaotic water, primordial chaotic water, and then the gods emerge up out of that chaos, and they rapidly become poorly behaved, and there's a lot of what we could only call murderous god soap opera that follows, and that includes a failed uprising by some against the powerful god Marduk. And then we find this. Opening his mouth, Marduk says, "Blood I will mass. and cause bones to be. I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Indeed, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, so that the gods might be at ease. So, as a result, one of the gods who betrayed Marduk is slain, and, quoting, out of his blood they fashioned mankind. And a third and final example is from Egypt. Now, what you need to know first, before I read this story, is that there were many temple sites in Egypt, in various places, various cities. And every major temple site in Egypt had its own creation story. And they all, and the purpose of this creation story was to justify having a temple at this particular holy site. And they all went something like this. At first, there was nothing but chaotic, dark, primordial water. This is a familiar pattern. And then a primary hill rises up out of the waters. So some gods, as it were, set up shop on this first hill, this primary hill, and creation occurs from there. And these temples were designed to be models of the cosmos. And so a creation story about the cosmos was also, for them, a creation story about their own temple. And each city had its own story, its own primary hill, justifying the existence of its own temple. So, with that in mind, in one particular story, the sun god Re appears on a hill, and he says, I came into being in this land, whereas the other gods stayed in the chaotic waters in which they were. They brought to me my eye with them, and it's capitalized in the translation because this eye actually has a mind of its own. It's like a separate creature. Some people think that third eye you see on some Egyptian art above the two eyes, up in the middle of the forehead, that this is this eye that has its own ability to move around, its own ability to think and have emotions. They brought to me my eye with them. After I had joined together my bodily members, I wept over them, and we read it's because he had forgotten to include the special eye. That is how men came into being, from the tears which came forth from my eye. Evidently, this independent creature, eye, went off wandering and came back, and the sun god had already made his own body and forgot to include the eye. The eye was upset. The jilted eye was upset, and those tears eventually led to mankind. And it was angry with me, this eye, after it returned and found that I had made another in its place. And in another Egyptian creation story, we read, I brought into being the four gods from my sweat, while men are the tears of my eye. So if we go back to the primary concerns we talked about in the last video, and this chart here, what we're going to be doing in this video is putting a creation story in there, what I'm calling creation story number 1. And we're not going to approach it from the left side, although I will come back at the end of this video to talk about what goes wrong when we do. We're going to look at it from the perspective of their primary concerns. And a creation story is specifically designed to address the 3 big, huge questions. What are the gods like? What is the world for? What are people for? That's what a creation story sets out to do. Now remember, we've already looked into how the normal ancient Near Eastern creation stories answer these huge questions, so let's look at them. What are the gods like? Well, the gods are not particularly well behaved, and they are primarily concerned with themselves. What is the world for? Well, the world is here as a somewhat safe place of rest for the gods. It's made by the gods for the gods. But chaos, which is represented by water in the stories, chaos surrounds us and is always a threat to destroy the world. What are people for? People are here as a slave class to do the hard labor for the gods. So you'll notice that everything is God-centric here. And these gods are selfish, arbitrary, fickle, and just not great characters. So let's go to the text. And now I'm not going to do this with every passage that we study in this video series, but I am going to do it this time because I think it's important. I'm going to read to you the entire text with commentary as we go, and I'm going to format it in such a way that you can see some patterns. So here we go. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And already there's something we can stop and point out, and that is we have surface of the deep and hovering over the waters. Once you've heard those other ancient Near Eastern creation stories, this makes sense. This is how, in the ancient Near East, this is how creation stories begin. There is nothing but water, and that water represents chaos. That's the signal that this is a creation story. If you don't know that, if you approach this from our scientific perspective, you end up asking yourself things like, how can there be water? God hadn't created anything yet. But that is not the way that they thought. And remember, our job is to do exegesis, which is, what did this mean then and there, before we start to ask what it means for us here and now. Okay, moving on. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. Now, if you read this aloud or heard it read aloud just now, something may have caught your attention here. What is this vault? It sounds solid, not vaporous. I know when I was younger, I thought, oh, it's sky. Oh, the waters above from the waters below? Oh, the waters above, that must mean the clouds. That's just what I thought. But that's not what it means. This is describing very accurately the common, quote-unquote, scientific understanding of the cosmos as it was understood in the ancient Near Eastern cultures. And this vault is solid, and it separates water above from water below, as you can see. There's water under it, there's water above it. Here's what that looks like. So this is just one artist's interpretation of what this looks like. You can see that the world is actually this bubble here. Okay, and this bubble is made up of earth and air, and there are columns of the earth that are holding it up. Sometimes these mountains at the very end are called the pillars of the earth, and their job is to hold up this vault. Here it is. This is the vault. And you'll notice that above there's like an ocean up there, and an ocean to the side, an ocean below, an ocean to the side. This is how they explain, by the way, where rain came from. I mean, because when it rains hard, it rains a lot. You'd have a hard time convincing an ancient person that all of that water that comes down and floods sometimes, desperately floods the earth, that really just comes from vaporous clouds. It just doesn't seem like that's enough in a vapor. Instead, they believed that there were floodgates up in this vault, and sometimes the gods would open these floodgates, and then the rains would come down. Okay, so this is the world, this is the picture of the cosmos that is being described here in that passage. Let's go on. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years, and let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. Notice two things. The first, maybe I'll turn off this highlight for a second. The first is, I don't know if you notice this when you read it aloud or when you hear me reading it aloud, or if you have ever thought this in the past, but have you ever asked yourself this question? Did they not have the word sun? Did they not have the word moon? What is all this effort? Two great lights, a greater light and a lesser light, and all this stuff. Why not just say God made the sun? It says he made the stars. Why not say God made the sun and the moon and the stars? Well, I'm not going to answer that question yet, but there is a reason that these words, there were perfectly good Hebrew words, and they were avoided on purpose, and I'll get back to that purpose later. The second thing I want to talk about, I'm highlighting here. Where are the sun and the moon and the stars? In the vault of the sky. We'll go back to our picture and you take a look. There they are. Not to be too flippant about things, but if you're going to actually read Genesis chapter 1 as if it were a work of science, as we understand it, then you probably shouldn't fly in an airplane, because there's danger of hitting the moon because it's in the sky, according to the text. But of course, it's not trying to be a modern scientific document. What it's doing is, as I say, describing very accurately what people thought of the cosmos back then. Okay, continuing. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful, and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make human beings in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." And we get, for the first time in the Bible, poetry, Hebrew poetry. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Now at this point, once more, I'm going to pause and interject and talk about these two rules, that human beings are called to subdue the world and rule over the creatures. This can strike us as a little bit uncomfortable, because when we think about subduing and when we think about ruling, what we think about is coercion. We think about subjugation. We think about misuse. And in fact, there have been a lot of scholarly articles talking about the environmental disaster in which we find ourselves, actually blaming the Christian worldview for the environmental damage, coming back to these passages, to this passage here, that Christians thought, and so therefore the Christian West, and then it sunk in deeply, and so therefore the general Western European worldview thinks that the world is just there to be used. We're to rule over it, to take from it whatever we want, to do with it whatever we want. So there is an accusation, and Also, it should be said that there are some Christians inside the church who think the same thing, who think that actually this passage means we can do whatever we want. And some Christians, when that's combined with an end times view that this world must be destroyed before the new heaven and the new earth can be instated, there are some Christians, and I don't think there are too many of these, but there are a fair number who think that actually hastening the destruction of the earth will bring the kingdom of God more quickly. So there's a lot that rides on these words, is what I'm trying to say. So the first thing that I want to mention is that one of the words here, the word rule, in Hebrew, is also used in a psalm in a way that refers to God keeping his people, meaning caring for them like a shepherd. So to rule means to keep in a gentle and loving way. And so that's why there are other Christians who interpret this in a different way, including my father-in-law, Lauren Wilkinson, who's written a book called Earth Keeping. And that's how he interprets this passage. So that we are don't think of it as rule as in subjugate, but think of it as rule as in keep, take care of. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is look at the context of these words, to rule and to subdue. We just read that human beings are in God's image, in the image of God. He created them. So and in fact, go back even a little bit further, let us make human beings in our image so that they may rule. So clearly, the ruling and the image bearing are related in this text, which means, to put it clearly, if we are to rule over the fish in the sea, etc., we are to rule as God does, because we bear the image of God. So we are to rule as God does. So the real question here is, well, how does God rule? And as we keep reading in early Genesis, what we're going to find is that the way God rules is not like the typical ancient Near Eastern God, and not at all like the typical ancient Near Eastern king, where they just took whatever they wanted and did whatever they wanted. This is a God who is slow to anger, quick to forgive, loyal, even in the face of disloyalty from his people. And this is a God who is a loving provider. In fact, if we keep on in the text now, what's the very next thing? We're just told to rule as God does, and what's the very next thing we read? We read this. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. So here is God, the loving provider. If we're to rule as God does. And one of the things that we read here is God provides. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing, so on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Okay, let's turn now to some analysis. And one of the things we're going to notice, and I hope you did notice this, was that Genesis 1 started off like a normal ancient Near Eastern creation story. Normal for the ancient Near East, with water. Primordial, chaotic water in which there is no structure and there are no things. That is normal. And so it would have been very, very obvious to the people listening to this, here comes a creation story. But as that story unfolds, it becomes clear that this is a radically new worldview that's being proclaimed. Very, very different. I'm going to offer you an analogy here, and I think this works, but if it doesn't, well, forgive me. And the analogy is Cinderella, of all things. The Cinderella story is so familiar. Yes, it has many, many different shapes and sizes and shades and traditions and whatnot, but it's very, very familiar. And so if I were to just start telling you a story and not tell you it was a Cinderella story, but just tell you about a young woman who has a happy home, but then her mother dies, and then her father remarries, and now she has a stepmother and stepsisters who treat her badly, and they get to go off to a ball eventually, and she doesn't. She's dressed in rags near the fire, and a fairy godmother shows up and provides her with a wonderful ball gown and glass slippers. I wouldn't have to tell you this was a Cinderella story. You would just know. And you know how the story is supposed to go. And as I keep telling it, she goes to the ball, she meets the prince falls in love with her. Well, at least falls in love with the idea of this beautiful woman. And then she has to leave quickly because the spell's about to run out. And then, of course, he searches through his kingdom looking for the young woman whose feet will fit in the glass slippers. Okay, so all this is normal. But what if, as I tell you the story, and again, no one has said this is a Cinderella story, what if right at the moment when the prince shows up at her house and her stepsisters can't get their feet in the slipper, but Cinderella could, and she knows she could, what if, just as she's about to go downstairs to put her foot into the glass slipper, what if she thought to herself, hey, wait a minute, this guy doesn't know me. He's not actually in love with me. He's just in love with the idea of a beautiful trophy wife. But he has no idea what I'm like. He doesn't know really what I like, what I don't like. He has no sense of my personality. You can't really get that in a ball when everyone's wearing all these fancy dresses. So what if she thought that and thought, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to end up a trophy wife. He either is in love with me or nothing. And so she somehow distorts her foot or puts some wrappings on it or something so that her foot doesn't fit in the slipper. And then the prince is discouraged and just one more failure and just moves on. And what if she offers to travel with him to help find someone whose foot will fit in the slipper, knowing full well that they will never find that person because she is that person. But what if she offers to help? And so she starts to travel along as part of his entourage. And as they travel for weeks around the land looking for a foot that fits in the slipper, they start to talk to each other. And as they start to talk to each other, he thinks, wow, she's a common girl, but I really enjoy her company. I like our conversations. And what if she thinks, wow, I just wrote him off as a rich prince who just was arrogant and didn't really care about anybody, but he's a wonderful person. And what if through talking to each other, they fall in love, but they don't know what to do about that until finally she proposes to him, which is, of course, unusual. And he accepts and agrees to marry her, even though she's, so far as he knows, not the one whose foot fit the slipper. And only when he falls in love with her as a person and agrees to marry her because of who she is, only then does she actually take her foot and put it in the glass slipper and show him what the whole situation really was. Okay, if I told you that, so it starts off like a normal Cinderella story and then has this twist at the end, I believe that what would grab your attention is the twist, the difference, the thing that you were not expecting. And that's what would stand out to you as the point of the story. And I believe you would say, okay, well, what Paul's doing is he's telling a story and putting a kind of a feminist or egalitarian twist on Cinderella. And he's, at one and the same time, he's criticizing the idea that being a trophy wife is the best possible end for a woman. But not only is he criticizing that idea, but he's also praising the idea that this prince and this woman Cinderella could be sort of equal partners in a relationship that is mutually, in which they flourish. So in the difference from what you were expecting, that's where you'd find my point. And what I'm saying is that when we understand what a normal ancient Near Eastern creation story is supposed to go like, and when we understand how radically different Genesis chapter 1 is, then we see that in those differences, that's where the gospel, the good news of Genesis, was being proclaimed. So what is God like? What is this place? What are we? Why are we here? Through the contrast, just like my feminist Cinderella story, it's where it's different that Genesis shouts and answers clearly. And here's what it says. God is a loving creator, successfully bringing order to chaos and fullness to emptiness. This place is, in a sense, God's temple, and it is good. And when I say this place, I mean the whole world. I'll come back to that. We are image bearers. We are here to rule creation lovingly and to delight in it. Okay, so those 4 points that are listed here, these 4 points are so different, so radically new. And even though it started like a normal creation story, it does not end like one. And in that surprise development, that's, I believe, where Genesis 1 is shouting the gospel. Let's look at some of the contrasts in more detail. I'm going to put in the left what was the default normal worldview of the ancient Near East, and on the right, what early Genesis is proclaiming, which is indeed radically new. Normal. There are many gods, as many as 600 in the Babylonian story. No, there is one God, says Genesis. The gods fuss and fight. No, God is God, and there is no contest. So there's a stability. The gods are never done fighting the chaos monster. In fact, in the Egyptian creation story, the sun god descends into the watery chaos every night. That's what the sunset is. And then all night fights a chaos monster that lives in the waters of chaos under the earth. And we only know that the god is victorious over the chaos monster when the sun rises. The sun god rises the next morning. So it's never finished. The fight is never finished. But in early Genesis, there is no chaos monster. Every creature in the deep is created. Temples are special places in an otherwise chaotic world. No, the entire cosmos is God's temple, says early Genesis. The world is basically hostile even to the gods. No, the world is good. How many times did we hear that? The world is good and very good at the end, and will remain ordered and full. The gods are never completely at rest, but God rests completely. The sun, moon, and stars are divine beings and are to be worshipped. That's the normal view. But early Genesis says, no, the sun, moon, and stars are created by God and are not to be worshipped. They are best understood as lamps in the temple of the cosmos. I will come back to that. People are here to be slaves to the gods. No. People made in the image of God are here to rule and subdue, but as God does, that is to say, lovingly. Normal view, people are the result of divine violence, anger, or sadness, but early Genesis says, no, people are wanted. People are wanted. We're not made out of the flesh or blood or tears of the gods. We are wanted, and it is good that we are here. It is good that light is here, and land, and plants, and birds, and fish, and animals. It is good and very good. Now, this idea here and this idea here, both having to do with the idea of a temple, is something that might not have jumped out at you from the text as we went through it, but I will come back to it and try to show you how these things are being proclaimed. So I promise you, we will come back to that. But in the meantime, here you can see in green, in the green box, this is the gospel that is proclaimed in Genesis chapter 1. So that's what we get with a quick look at the outside, looking at the ancient Near East and looking at the contrasts. Now we're going to turn and look to the inside, to the literary structure of these days. Now, analyzing the structure is not just something to do for kicks. It's actually important because in the ancient Near East and in Hebrew literature, the structure of a passage is often very important because it's a key. It tells us what the authors thought were important points. Helps us understand the passage. It shows us the main points. And the kinds of ways you can play around with literary structure are things like the shape of a text, the repetition in the text, the rhyming. And I should tell you that the Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme sounds, it rhymes meaning. So you say the same thing two different ways, that would be their way of rhyming. So if you've ever wondered why the poetry of the Psalms has so much repetition, and the reason is not that they forgot what they said and had to say it again, but the reason is that that's actually how they rhymed. And parallelism, which is where you use similar phrases or often identical phrases to connect different passages. Well, we're going to look at the structure of Genesis 1, and the very first sentence is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, that's a pretty straightforward thesis statement, but it's followed by a rather curious sentence. Now, the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now, we've already talked about the deep and the waters, and that's not very curious because that's how you start a creation story in this time and place. But it's the other part. The earth was formless and empty. That might just seem like filler as we wait for the story to begin. And I know I, growing up, always sort of skipped over this part because it didn't seem really important. Let's get to the creation. But actually, it sets the agenda. It sets the agenda. Look, when you listen to what Genesis 1 sounds like, it becomes obvious that there's a lot of repetition, especially when you hear it read aloud. It's highly structured, and the repetition is the key to the structure. What do we hear? Things like, and God said, and it was so. God saw that it was good. There was evening, and there was morning, the first day, the second day, the third day. Clearly, this is not an accident, and clearly, the story is being divided up into these days, and again, in a very highly structured way. So let's look at these days. And let's go back to that statement. The earth was formless and empty. Again, that sets the agenda for what happens in the next 6 chunks of the story, or the next 6 days. Let's go through it. Day 1. The categories of light and dark are created. In day 2, the categories of sky and waters are created. And in day 3, the categories of dry land and plants are created. So what do we have? The earth is no longer formless. Formless means no categories, and now we have categories. But those categories are still empty, so we move to the next column. In day 4, God creates the sun and the moon and the stars. Notice what happens. These particulars fill up, as it were, the categories of light and dark. Now those categories are not empty. Moving to day 5. What is created? Birds and water creatures. And you'll notice that those fill up the categories of sky and waters. And on day 6, and then we have, the additional blessing to be fruitful and increase in number. So something is added to the formula on day 5. And on day 6, a lot of stuff will get added. But first, land creatures and humans. Notice that those fill up the dry land. And in turn, as a bit of a twist, the plants fill up the land creatures and humanity. And then again, the blessing to be fruitful and increase in number, followed by the word to humans, to rule over the earth and creatures. Also, here's your food, and it's very good. So on day 6, clearly the formula grows, and day 6 is the longest, most involved day. I want you to notice that if you only memorize one column, you actually can memorize the other. It's structured in such a way that it would be easy to remember and then say to someone else. All you need to remember is light and dark, sky and waters, dry land and plants, and then you've got the rest because of how they're related. Now, there are 2 special days, I feel, in this story, which we get from the structure. The first one is pretty obvious. It's day 6. If we take a look at the chart, it's pretty obvious that this is the big day. It's obvious because it's near the end. It's also obvious because of how much more goes on in this day. And it's also pretty clear that what makes this day so special is that this is when humanity shows up. Now, that might seem arrogant and make you feel just a little bit uncomfortable. But if you think about it, humans are described in ways that, in the ancient Near Eastern world, ways that would have been associated with kings and with kingship. They are to rule with a God-given authority. They are image bearers. They are provided with food. So that is special. And this takes us back to some big questions. What are we? Why are we here? What are we for? Again, let's look at the differences. The normal ancient Near Eastern answer, we're a slave class created to serve the gods. But the Gospel of Genesis 1 says, and this is emphasized by the structure of the days, which points us to day 6, all human beings, male and female, are exalted in creation as image-bearing, loving rulers. Okay, so that's day 6. But there's another special day in this story, and that is day 7, which is a little unfair of me to say since it's not even on this diagram, so let's put it there now. On day 7, God rests. And that also is pretty important, and here's why. Another way of looking at Genesis 1 is that it is actually a temple inauguration story. A temple inauguration story in the ancient Near East is the story of what happened when we dedicated this temple. Not so much when we built it, but when we dedicated it. And remember, back then, temples represented the cosmos. So a temple inauguration story is also, in a symbolic way, a cosmos creation story. All right, so there are some clues that Genesis 1 is intended to be a temple inauguration story. Here's one of them, the number 7. Many ancient Near Eastern temple inauguration texts have now been unearthed and translated, and the number 7 is prominent among them. And thus the 7 days become significant because I think they signal that this is a temple text. Also, on the 7th day, God rests. Now, in the ancient Near Eastern normal worldview, divine rest could only occur in a temple. And at the end of the temple inauguration ceremony, the god was thought to have been installed in the temple and to have found a kind of rest. And so we have the same kind of thing here. We have inauguration of the cosmos, and then God rests. And another really important clue is on day 4, when the sun and the moon are created, and the sun and the moon are never mentioned. I already talked about that, so now I'm going to give you the reason for it. There are perfectly good, as I said, Hebrew words for sun and moon, but we don't get that. Instead, we get a Hebrew word that actually shows up elsewhere in the Old Testament when describing the temple lamps, or the lamps in the tabernacle. So instead of saying the sun and the moon, the passage says the greater temple lamp and the lesser temple lamp. And that was for 2 reasons, a negative reason and a positive reason. The negative reason. The Hebrew word for sun, unfortunately, sounded a lot like the typical name of the sun god in the ancient Near East. And the Hebrew word for moon likewise sounded a bit like the moon god. And so by avoiding those Hebrew words, this was a way of just not saying the names of the sun god and the moon god. Maybe a little bit like in the Harry Potter stories, when they don't want to say Voldemort, instead they just say you-know-who, because one way to not give anyone, to make sure you don't give anyone any accidental respect, is to just avoid their names. But also, that's the negative reason. Here's the positive reason. By declaring the sun a temple lamp and the moon a temple lamp, what you're really declaring is that the whole world is a temple. The whole world is a special place. The whole world can be understood as God's temple, and in that good and very good temple, God can find rest. Okay, we have looked outside at the ancient Near East. We have looked inside at the structure. And what we have found is this gospel right here. Pretty amazing and good stuff. Now, remember, we have our primary concerns in our largely technological and scientific culture, where we tend to be interested in just finding scientific facts and lining them up. And I mentioned that it's a little bit tending toward OCD, at least compared to the ancient world. Their primary concerns were different. Here's the problem. If we approach Genesis chapter 1 from the left side here, from looking at our primary concerns, we can get ourselves so tangled up by thinking about things like, well, were they 24-hour days, or does it mean just a long period of time? We ask questions like that. Or we ask questions like, wait a minute, how could there be an evening and a morning the first day, evening and a morning the second day, etc., if the sun doesn't show up until day 4? Because to be an evening and to be a morning, there has to be a sunset and a sunrise. So how does that work? Or we can get tangled up with questions like, hold on, Genesis 1 says that plants arrive before fish. But the scientific record clearly shows that fish show up a long time before plants. So does that mean Genesis 1 is wrong? Does that mean that the science is wrong? What do we do with this tension? And what we have to do with the tension is this. We have to stop approaching an ancient creation story from a modern scientific perspective, because that's just not what it's designed to do. Instead, what it's designed to do, and this is what exegesis can help us with, what did it mean then and there? And what it meant then and there was addressing these huge questions, the biggest questions we can ask. What is God like? What's the world for? What are people for? And the way Genesis 1 answers those questions is seen right here, down the right column, what I call the gospel according to early Genesis. And it is indeed beautiful, good, and very good. Well, that concludes our look at Group 1, which is looking at the creation story in Genesis 1. Next time we will begin to treat the stories that we find that are associated with Eden. Until then, bye for now.